Would a solver beat 25 NL? This sounds like such an obvious question. It sounds like it must be clickbait, because surely the answer has to be yes, right? Do you know what, guys? I've been tweeting a lot about this recently. It's not at all obvious or clear to me that the answer is yes to this question. We are talking about post-rake here, which is absolutely no easy feat to beat a game like 25 NL after rake. Yes, the game has got some weaker regulars and amateur players in it and recreationals and things like that. But here's the thing, rake is quite high. So I'm going to just briefly outline how we're going to debate today's topic, how I'm going to try and reach a logical conclusion by the end of this video about whether a solver would win at 25 NL. The first thing I'm going to talk about is what rake structures are generally like at these stakes, how much you pay, how you pay it, and how easy it is for a human to beat that. I'm going to move on and talk about the talents and the skills of a solver. What does it do a lot better than a human? What things is it infinitely more powerful at? Because clearly there are many things in poker that it's much, much better at than humans. Processing power, for one, just gives it the ability to do this. Then I'm going to move on and talk about its deficiencies in part 3. What are the deficiencies of the solver, and how might these actually allow it to have a lower win rate in some spots than a regular would have? We'll then talk about how the solver may play certain spots compared to a bad reg, how it may play compared to a good reg, and what the win rates of a bad reg and a good reg typically are as defined by me in a game like 25 NL. This is a useful reference point. It's kind of like a benchmark for measuring, well, we know what the solver's like compared to these players, and we know what these players typically achieve in terms of win rate or lack thereof, so maybe we can use that to actually ground our analysis a little bit. In my podcast, Poker Distilled, recently, myself and Melissa, my co-host, talked about chaos and order and how they relate to poker. In part 6 and 7 of this video, I'm going to be talking about why people are so drawn like moths to the flame of copying solver outputs, GTO, that sort of thing. I know we mock those people a lot with nerdy voices and stuff in this channel, but I do want to actually try and strongman their case and show you what might be wrong with it and why they feel like they have to do it. And maybe I can even get through to you. Maybe you're someone who studies with solvers. Maybe you're a coach that teaches people to copy solvers. Maybe you just spent an hour with a student on getting the right sizing that the solver does on this turn because it's easy for you to teach that way. Maybe I can get through to you too. Maybe I can get through to your students. Maybe I can get through to brand new players just wondering if and how they should use a solver. And then we'll get to the verdict. Would a solver beat 25 NL or not? Let's find out. Conclusion at the end of this video. Watch the whole debate. Don't skip right to it. Leave me your thoughts and comments. Let's get a healthy, polite, respectful discussion going. If you're outraged by this, if you're hurt by this, can I just give you some advice? Take a minute before you write on the comment section. Take a minute to make sure that you've calmed down and organized your thoughts. It's very easy these days to just sort of keyboard warrior and write out some outrage and maybe even be rude or disrespectful to me or other people in the community. I don't want that, you know? I want to be nice to you guys. I want you guys to be nice to me. Let's all get along, but let's be kind of brutal here. Let's get to the bottom of this issue and have a respectful discussion afterwards. Hope you enjoy it. Let's get started. So this video is about to get pretty intense in a sort of logical, philosophical discussion way. So before it does, how about we just analyze the AI's attempt to depict robot plays poker. So we'll start off with this image, which is deeply disturbing. There seems to be a deformed robot being kept alive by some sort of crank arm that's attached to a screen there in the background, totally ruining that game. This guy doesn't really seem to know which chips are which. He's like studies. This is the kind of player that like takes like 20 minutes to fold 8-3 off under the gun. This guy should be banned. This is an abomination, this dealer. This isn't even poker. This is some kind of roulette with an absolute monstrosity for a dealer. Not a fan. Obnoxious idiot that's like taking up the entire table. These poor little guys, okay, they're a bit smaller, but look how downtrodden the one on the right is. I mean, imagine being bullied out of your own space like that. These are like end boss crushers, like some kind of 10k NL GTO bots or something. Horrible opponents to face. This player is pondering how he got here from outer space and why there seem to be like almond stones in the middle of the table or some kind of like pips of a fruit or something instead of the small blind and big blind. A fair question. This guy is reaching for a sachet of salt, or maybe one of those things that actually preserves the wood inside your like chest of drawers when you buy it, you know, those little weird sachets. This guy is like the Phil Hellmuth of the robot world. He's like reaching across into some other player's stack and taking chips and tantruming and no doubt swearing and cursing. This is a really deformed scene, like total degeneracy, hedonism gone too far, and here we have a heads-up grudge match between some female poker player with a bionic arm and a weird, like, white, bizarre monstrosity, and that'll be televised, probably streamed on WSOP. And here we have a normal bar with slot machines and a lovely robot having a great time. Back to this one. Oh my god, like this one is just disturbing, that poor thing in the background. Anyway, I'm going to let this lovely carousel of entertainment revolve as we get into today's topic. The first thing I want to discuss is rake. So rake is obviously the tax we pay in the game. There is a rake percentage and there's a rake cap. At 25 NL on stars, I think the rake cap is about 8 big blinds and the rake percentage is about 5%. What that means is, don't quote me on this, but what that means is, if I'm right, is that when you play a 200 big blind pot and it is raked up to 8 big blinds, well, you're looking at a lot of big blinds coming out of the pot. You're looking at 8 of the 200 big blinds coming back out. So that's actually 10 big blinds would be 5% of that. So when that happens, what's really going on there is that you haven't reached, well, you've kind of reached the cap, but most of the money is still being taxed. So it's only like 2 big blinds you save there from there being no cap. So basically at 25 NL, because the cap is quite high, 8 big blinds, that goes down to like 4 big blinds, 2.5 big blinds as you go higher in stakes. The rate becomes more reasonable, obviously. So 25 NL, usually the BB per 100 rake, that rake percentage and rake cap actually lead to, is between about 7.5 and 9 BBs per 100. This is a hell of a lot. And sure, you can get some kind of rake back, but the point is that ignoring rake back for now, these games are really tough. Like microstakes games in general, although like you have a big skill edge, it's really hard in online poker, especially Zoom formats where you can't really get specific player type reads as easily, and you know that you maybe have a skill edge on pool or on a certain player type, but you don't really know much about specifically how to exploit them. Got that image again. Every time that comes up, I think I'm just going to wince a little bit, guys. That robot in the background gives me the creeps. But yeah, I think it's really important to understand that what we're talking about here is a post-rake win rate. And when we say would a solver beat 25 NL, we mean would it beat it badly enough? Would it beat it by 8, 9, 10, 11 BB per 100 pre-rake? To the point where it's still winning after rake. And I don't think that's so obvious in 6max. I'll just quickly touch on why that would be quite easy heads up. Heads up, you play almost every hand you're dealt as the button. You have like a small fold range where your skill edge is gone. So when you're dealt your fold range pre-flop, like your skill edge is neutralized there. But that only happens about 15% of the time, you know, people opening about 80-85% on the button heads up. So when you play heads up, you're involved in just about every hand, and having a very large BB per 100 is much more possible because you don't have all this downtime, this game dilution where you're actually forced to fold like you do in a 6max game. If your VPIP is only about 22 or something, as it should be, in a 6max game, 23, 24, whatever, then you're going to struggle to turn a skill edge into a large BB per 100 because many of those 100 hands, like maybe even 70 to 80 of them, are going to be spent just mucking some random hand before the flop, or folding 9s when it goes open 3-bet, cold 4-bet, or folding 8s when it goes open and 3-bet before you, and stuff like that. So you really can't play that many hands before the flop, but there's 6 players at the table. That's 3 times as many as heads up, and so it's no wonder that the solver's win rate gets heavily diluted per 100 hands because of that. So that's the second thing I want to say. So already here we're painting a landscape where it's no easy feat for the solver to actually win in these games. We have the very high rake environment that's unreasonable and hostile, and then of course we have this idea that so many hands are just spent folding pre-flop, diluting any edge that the solver may have against pool. I want to state as well, it's impossible that the solver is losing to a pool of humans. That cannot be the case. The solver plays a pseudo-Nash equilibrium strategy, which means it has absolutely no long-term holes in its game. There's no way to exploit it, basically. So we know that the solver wouldn't be losing pre-rake, but it could be losing post-rake. That's the idea for today. Now, let's start by outlining the solver's talents, what it's good at, and what it's better than humans at. Where does it overperform compared to its human counterparts? Solvers overperform in the following areas. Firstly, we have the ability to be unexploitable. As we've talked about before, we may refer to this as balance or lack of openings for counter-exploitation, or not having frequency holes in their game. They get frequencies exactly right so that they've neutralized you no matter what you try to do against them. You're not going to gain any EV. They're extremely conservative actually in that respect. Their whole algorithm doesn't wire them to try to exploit you or spot deficiencies in your game, although you could build a poker bot that tried to do that. That's not what we're talking about today. When we talk about a solver, we talk about a GTO seeking algorithm. So Game Theory Optimal as an output, as a strategy, has the strength that if you were to glean perfect information about how that strategy operates, you still couldn't do anything about it. If you could see their hand, it would be a different thing, of course. Now, how useful is that? How powerful is it for your opponents to have no way of exploiting your strategy, even if they had perfect transparency as to what your strategy is? Pause the video, have a think about it if you want. The answer is, in my opinion, not useful at all. And the reason for that is that in the vast majority of spots, merely having the knowledge to understand how your opponent would play their whole range is very difficult to come by. Like, having any knowledge about that at all is difficult to come by. You can make some assumptions about what pool is doing, etc. But I don't really see why it's great to have a completely flawless, unexploitable strategy from a counter-exploitability point of view when effectively there's just no way that people are going to find out about that, even if you were exploitable. So if the solver did have like some holes in its game or it was unbalanced in some spots, it would take you a very long time to learn what those were and what to do about it. And I believe there are Pokébots that do play like that, but that's not what we're talking about today. So right away, the areas where the solver really shines over the reg in terms of counter-exploitability don't seem to be particularly useful in the real world. I don't think those would give the solver a big edge over a regular and a bigger win rate than the regular would have at all, really. The second thing about the solver would be that it plays spots much more accurately in terms of finding the theoretically highest EV line. So if it's a mistake to c-bet a certain flop in game theory with a certain hand, the solver will never make that c-bet. If a hand has too much showdown value to bluff on the turn, the solver ain't bluffing that hand. If the solver gets to the river and the blockers of a hand render that hand slightly inferior to call against something in its opponent's range, the solver's never making that call. It's going to make every bluff that's winning, no bluffs that are losing in theory. So this absolute impeccable infallibility when it comes to getting the theoretical EV right is certainly a tick in the column of the solver being able to beat 25 NL, but I don't think that it's conclusive, and here's why. Generally, the edges you get by choosing a certain combo to bluff over another, unless you're playing like an absolute barbarian, and we're not comparing total fish to solvers today, we're comparing them to break-even regs to see if they perform better than break-even regs. Again, you may intuitively just think, of course they do, Pete, but let me play devil's advocate here, let me continue. The idea is that although they are infinitely more theoretically accurate, theoretical strokes are not very big ones. So if you imagine you're painting a wall and you're trying to make the wall all one color, which is say green to maximize EV, theoretical strokes are like a very thin paintbrush, and when you get those right, when you get those in the right place, they add a little bit of paint to the wall that's in the color that you want. The problem is that the exploitative strokes are big, thick paintbrushes. So this analogy is a bit weird, so let me give you a slightly better one. Imagine that there's a leaf outside in your courtyard or in your garden, or maybe outside on the street if you live in an apartment or something, and that leaf is sat there, and on your way home from wherever one night you see the leaf and you say, okay, I'm gonna predict where that leaf is going to be in the morning, and I'm going to set up a hairdryer outside that's blowing very faintly on the leaf, and it's going to blow the leaf in a certain direction, and I'm going to measure where the leaf is the next day and make a prediction about where the leaf will be when I wake up in the morning. And your main calculations are you're using the hairdryer to measure where the leaf is being blown, how fast it's being blown, how far it will travel. You're ignoring all external factors. In the morning, where the leaf is obviously doesn't have very much to do with the hairdryer at all, assuming it's a kind of faint blast, and has a lot to do with just the wind and the weather and people walking past and dogs kicking the leaf into little pieces and it raining and the leaf disintegrating into a puddle and going down a drain and all sorts of things like that. Basically, nature or the external environment has a much bigger effect on where the leaf ends up than your hairdryer does. Now, in this analogy, theory and the stuff that the solver is very good at getting right is the hairdryer. The solver is very good at finding one combo instead of another. It's also good at avoiding huge blunders too, but then so are many regulars. Not all of them at these stakes, but there are regs that can mostly avoid blunders in these games and not do abhorrent, egregious things. In the real world, what happens in poker is that the exploitative play is the storm, it's the wind, it's nature, and it tends to move the leaf, that's the EV, much more than the hairdryer, the theoretical picture, would suggest. So when we say the solver is so good at like setting up the hairdryer so that it blows the leaf into exactly the spot that it predicts it's going to go to, it might be good at that, but in the real world, the gust of wind comes the other way and now it's miles down the street in the opposite direction. So a poker example would be, if this guy here, the solver with the big obnoxious arms, is playing against the fish, a weaker player, and the fish is a total calling station, and the solver decides that they will check raise the turn and go all in the river against the calling station's pot-sized turn bet, guess what's going to happen? That's right, that guy with the obnoxious arms, that solver, that robot, is going to blunder EV on both the turn and the river, and it's going to do so in a really big pot when they have the bluff part of their range. Now, of course, when they have the value part, they'll make it all back, but that's not the point. The decent reg, or even the average reg, can just not bluff the fish in the first place and still make all the money with the value hand. So you can't use the argument that the solver's value range will earn the money back. We know that, but we're trying to beat rake here. We're trying to actually have an edge against this fish, and the solver doesn't do that as well. It has some edge against the weaker player because the weaker player makes a ton of blunders, like anti-theoretical plays that cost money objectively, but it doesn't make as much exploitatively from that player's errors as the regular does, and that really is one of the biggest cruxes of my argument. So when we compare the solver, its advantages to, the things it lauds over the average reg, it feels like, although they are nice to have, and I would love to know exactly what the theoretical EV of every hand was in every spot, I do think they pale into insignificance in the exploitative domain. The question is whether getting tons of micro and small swing decisions right where others get them wrong is equal to more than like the money saved by blasting off against stations and stuff like that in big pots. Because 25NL is a game that's largely the money comes from the weaker players, that's where money comes from. That's why table selection is so important. That's why someone like Garrett Adelstein did so well on Hustler Live back in the day, because he was pit at a table full of recreational players playing for high stakes. So this is a very common thing that people obsess over table selection for good reason, and that's because the average fish, according to studies that have been conducted in my Discord group, adds between 5 and 8 BB per 100 to a player's win rate. That means that having that fish at the table compared to not having that fish at the table is so impactful, because so much money comes from that fish not being a reg, being a fish instead, that actually it's way more important than any of the reg on reg win rates. If it were true that solvers could just do extremely well by being kind of flawless in these reg on reg situations, then we would actually expect bigger regs to have larger win rates over lesser regs than they really do. Usually when you're a good reg and you're playing in a game full of bad regs, you have a very mediocre win rate actually in 6 max heads up, because of the dilution principle, because of the fact that so many of the hands you play actually just don't get to do you don't get to do anything because you're dealt jack 4 off and you fold in the cutoff, or one of the other countless situations that comes up where you're not involved, where you don't VPIP. So the solver, for all of its merit, I don't think that those merits really give it much of a trump card to play in this game. I don't think that it can claim to earn anything near the BB per 100 obtained by being at the table with a weaker player, by being really accurate against regs, because it's no more accurate against fish than it is against regs. It just plays the same strategy, right? The solver is blind to all sorts of information that are telling it to deviate. It misses every potential good deviation and doesn't make any bad ones either, but I'm going to say the following. For a reg in a game of poker, there are many more good deviations possible than bad ones that you are likely to make. So I feel like if I sit down in a 200 zoom game or 500 zoom game, I'm going to be at a table with like 1 fish and 4 regs or something on average, and there will be some bad deviations that I'm likely to make there, and they're on my radar and I may get them wrong sometimes. But when I'm against that 1 fish, the deviations I'm making, I'm incredibly certain are very strong. Now I know that I'm talking about a 25NL reg here and comparing the solver to those stakes, but I really think that the good deviations that we can make are so impactful, they're so important to win rate, and the solver being less prone to blunder is a lesser source of EV. That would be my initial impression on this. Now you can let me know what you think in the comments. If you like this sort of debate type video, do smash the like button. I've got so much to get through here, which is why I'm kind of flying through it. Let's get on to the next point. We know that a bad reg, and I know this from coaching over a long period of time, usually has a win rate of something like -3, -2 BB per 100, sometimes -5 or 6 if they're quite weak in the game they're playing. It's rarely going to be up at like 9 or 10, but usually it's something that you can observe. They have some kind of loss rate that's observable and reasonable in magnitude. If the solver was the same as a bad reg, then it would be slightly losing in the game. A good reg has a win rate of about +3, +4 BB per 100 in a game like 25 zoom. It's really hard to have a win rate bigger than that without like exact player type reads in a softer player pool, although I guess it's possible. It's really rare. And so the question now becomes, how does the solver really compare to each of these player archetypes? Well, if you take the bad reg first of all, the solver avoids a good deal more blunders than the bad reg, but then the bad reg and the good reg were only a few BB per 100 apart. They were only about like 6 or 7 BB per 100 apart max, which just shows that like the best reg and one of the worst regs, there's not going to be a tremendous difference there. So if one isn't a winner pre-rake, they neither will be a winner post-rake. So when we compare the solver to that bad reg, it's still true that the bad reg plays many, many big pots much better than the solver does. Now let's think about this for a second, and I mean this exploitatively. At 25 zoom, as I've argued before, there are many fish in the pool, and when you come across the fish, that's where your win rate really resides the most. There are many times when a fish is so unbalanced and is playing such an absurdly face-up and bad strategy that it is completely essential that you leave game theory in order to make a massive amount of extra BBs. For example, if you're in a 3-bet pot and the fish snap calls you on the turn on a board like King, Queen, 4-4 deuce, when you bet the turn and they're tilted and they look like a maniac, they snap call the turn bet, and you have about half pot left in the river, you have about 50 big blinds that you could jam here into 100, let's say. Well, in GTO here, the solver's going to bluff a ton of stuff. It's going to think that its fold equity is enough here for half pot. It's going to think it's got 33% fold equity. But if in fact you only have 10% or 15% fold equity on average against that archetype of player, then you are losing many, many, many big blinds when you make this jam. Now, both players in this spot, the solver and the reg, probably make the same number of big blinds with their value combos. They just jam the river for value. I think they'll each be good at that, but maybe the bad reg makes more money by sometimes deciding to jam thinner against this total station. I know I'm picking a really one-sided scenario here that really favors the bad reg over the solver, but I want to show you that it is possible for a bad reg to win way more money in a spot than a solver does. So when they get there with nothing, they've barreled the turn with a gutter, let's say, or something like that, and the river comes to brick, and the dude is snap checked and snap called the turn bet and looks furious and angry and tilted. The solver doesn't understand any of that, bluffs the river, loses all that money. The bad reg gives up a lot of the time. Maybe not always. Maybe they blunder sometimes and bluff because they're a bad reg after all and they don't recognize that this is a really underfolded spot. But overall, they're going to give up way more often than the solver will with air because they're going to recognize some of this stuff, and the solver is going to just fritter away countless big blinds. I don't know, like probably that 50 big blind bet is going to lose something like 20, 25 big blinds if the fold equity is really low in EV, and that would be very bad. It's very hard to come back from something like that. That's enough to, you know, if you're talking about swings of 3 or 4 BB per 100, 20 big blinds, it takes you 500-600 hands just to make that back. So you can see how costly these big mistakes in big pots could actually be, and how the solver's large exploitative errors that it makes are actually just going to condemn it to having a really low win rate. I actually have a little bit of empirical evidence for my claim here, for my sort of questioning that a solver couldn't beat 25NL, that I'm going to share with you later on, so do stay tuned for that. I do have something a bit more scientific here for you guys, but we'll get to that. The next thing I want to talk about is how the solver compares to the good reg. Well, what does it do better? As we've said, it just earns a bit more EV in certain spots. It has more ability to select its combos properly, to bluff, its frequencies are cleaner, all of these things that don't really matter that much. Now, I've had some objections on Twitter when we've been having this discussion, and some people have said, well, the solver will run over the pool because it'll bluff more than a reg at these games. And I agree that in many spots the solver will bluff more, but there's this thing called post-filtering. Post-filtering is when a weaker poker player, amateur poker player, maybe like weak reg or whatever, has called a lot of chips, has like maybe called a big turn bet, has called an over bet, has called a check raise, has bet and then called twice. All of this sort of thing is called a 4-bet and called twice. A lot of the time in those spots, fold equity is very low. We know this from mass data. I made a whole exploitative course on this that's coming out in the summer called Grade E of the Carrot Poker School. For the theory school, do check out carrotcorner.com. You can grab that now without having to wait. Grade E will be out in the summer on carrotcorner.com. But in Grade E, we observed all of this, that post-filtering, you know, after these big contractions happened to ranges, there was just a massive decline in fold equity after that. And I think one of the biggest things we should say here in response to the comment that the solver would do a great job of running over the game would just be like, sure it would in overfolded spots, I agree. In big pots like triple barrels where those are overfolded, which is kind of rare but does exist for sure. It's not rare actually, I shouldn't say that, but it's certainly not like really common. The solver is going to do a better job than the reg. But what about small pots? Small pots are actually super overfolded and they are exploited as well. So what I mean by exploited is that a good reg understands that when they're checked to by a preflop raiser at 25NL that they have far more fold equity than they're supposed to have. They know that their turnover bets on certain textures are going to work way more often than they should. They know that check raising range bets is going to work way more often than it should. We talk about this in the very first episode of Cash Injection, our exploitative course. So because all of this is true, isn't the solver playing a small pot worse than a good reg because they're not actually capitalizing that much on aggression? Solvers are actually quite restrained in the face of preflop raisers checking to them. And the reason for that is that they don't expect to have a range advantage or a surplus of fold equity, and so they keep their strategy kind of in check here. That's not the case for a good reg that knows that fold equity is way higher. So in response to the person that objects here and says, well, the solver is using fold equity to run over the game and winning a ton of small pots and big pots alike, I don't think they are winning enough small pots on the early streets. And I definitely don't think that all of the aggression they use in big pots is good. I think a lot of it is terrible, actually. So I hope I'm at least making you reconsider here. If you were firmly in the solver would beat 25 NL camp, I hope I'm at least giving you reason to go back to the drawing board and reconsider. Maybe you don't agree yet that the solver wouldn't beat 25 NL, but maybe you're a bit less sure that it would. That's really all I'm sort of going for. Okay, why do people get a bit touchy about this subject? Because I've definitely noted this on Twitter that people are kind of coming back against what I'm saying, but they're not really giving so far a great argument as to why the claim is wrong. I was definitely playing devil's advocate in the last few days prior to this recording when I said I don't think the solver would beat 25 NL, because I don't know yet. I'm still exploring. I'm leaning that way, but I'm not totally sure yet. But a lot of people were like, someone just came on and said, that's not right. Someone else came on and said, no, that's wrong. Some other people came on and said, yeah, but, and then gave some vague argument like, oh, the solver will be aggressive and it'll be more aggressive and it'll be better. I've heard people come up with all sorts of like weird, flimsy, like straw man sort of arguments for why the solver would still win without really addressing my arguments. And some people have given a bit of a stronger take, you know, some arguments that were really worth me considering. But I would say that I've had quite a lot of backlash without very much logic. And you could say, well, Pete, bless you, that's just the way of the internet. Welcome to Twitter. You know, it's all polarization and no one really thinking through anything. And while that might be true, I'm kind of sensing that it's easier to make a strong case that the solver wouldn't beat 25 NL than to make a case that it would. I just don't really see where the EV is coming from to make up for all of the exploitative failures that the solver is actually succumbing to. Yeah, it's interesting. Why do people get touchy about this? Why are people sort of unwilling to climb down from the mountain of the solver would crush any game and the solver's the guru? And why are people keen to want to simplify the game to copy the solver? I taught a student a couple of weeks ago that actually met me for the first time and said, I want you to convince me today, Pete, that I shouldn't just copy GTO. I think I believe you, but I don't fully understand why I shouldn't just copy it yet. Can we talk about that? And I said, absolutely. We spent like the first half an hour of our one-to-one session like fully discussing this. And by the end of it, he was like, yeah, you've definitely convinced me. Thank you for that. And I think it's important to understand why it's actually completely flawed to try to just copy GTO. People like it because it simplifies things. It's like a clinging to order. I talked about chaos and order with Melissa, my co-host, in episode 2 of the Poker Distilled podcast. You can find that on Spotify if you want to have a look. We talked about this in great length. People are always trying to put up the walls to build a fortress. When I was a kid, I remember building cardboard forts in my friend's house and getting mad that he was so much better at building things than me. Still the case, I suck at building things. But why do kids build forts? Why do we want to put up the walls? Why do we want to nest? We want to protect ourselves from chaos. Chaos is frightening, and in poker, chaos could be having no ability to figure out what's best and being lost. Aspiring poker players almost spend their careers in a perpetual state of being lost. And this is disconcerting, it's frightening, and it really puts people off wanting to play the game. So in order to make this game that they like more tangible and safer and actually be able to accommodate it in their psyche and in their lives, they cling to order, right? They want everything to be, there is an objective answer that I can study, and there is. It's called the Carrot Poker School, guys, of course. Jokes aside, though, well, that's not a joke, I do believe that, but my shameless promotion aside, I don't actually think that for a second the solver gets close to that, and it comes down to this question of what is correct? What does the word correct mean? Is it correct to just do something that another poker robot is doing against some strategy that's not the one that you're facing? Can that be correct? Can the highest EV way for you to play possibly be by playing against someone else's strategy other than your opponent's? If you want to answer yes to that, I don't understand your logic or the way your mind is working. That sounds extremely wrong to me. I think this is a reductio ad absurdum, where we basically reduce something to absurdity in order to show that it can't possibly hold logically and must be wrong. It's definitely not the highest EV way to play against someone else's strategy. You can't take a strategy that's right against A and then play it against B and expect it to be the best strategy. Just like if I was playing rock, paper, scissors and you were doing 1/3 rock, 1/3 paper, 1/3 scissors, and then I played against someone else that was only doing rock, we can't say that like the GTO strategy of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 is also right against that person. Maybe like long term, if they have infinite adjustment ability, yes, and we're going to play for infinity, but that's not the case in poker. We're playing in a very finite, exploitative non-repercussion environment where you're just not going to get punished for these things. So in order to start to wrap this up, I think that people do tend to hold on to the belief that GTO is more powerful and is something that can be directly applied. And I think GTO is infinitely powerful. I think theory is amazing. And I spent years and years digging around in solvers, learning the physics of the game, learning the nuts and bolts, the atoms, the axioms, and just knowing how the game works eventually as a result of that, and to a very, very deep level, much more than I did a few years ago. And what I did with that information was I humanized it, I brought it into courses, I put it into principles and graphics and rules and laws and slides and videos and all sorts of things to show people how the game works. Once you have that, you're free reign. You can figure out the best strategy on your own. You can swim. You're not dependent on some life raft to keep you afloat. GTO is a life raft. Clinging onto it and trying to apply a direct GTO output is a life raft when actually just floating there isn't going to cut it. You need to actually get somewhere. You need to actually travel. You need to learn to swim, not float. People that are copying GTO are floating, not swimming. Embrace the chaos. When you start swimming, sure, you're not on your raft anymore. You could drown. It's a bit scarier. And when you start swimming, you're going to have to come up with things on the spot, on the fly. Your study's going to be less clear. Everything's going to be murkier. There's going to be a lot more subjective disagreement between you and your peers. You're not going to understand everything that people say to you. You're going to refute and reject some of it. It's going to be a process and it's going to be a journey, but it's going to be a magical one because you're going to move away from theory towards seeing the light, seeing the truth of True EV. And True EV, I didn't realize when I came up with that concept it was going to become such a meme, but I'm glad it has because there's no better way to describe why I think a solver would struggle to beat 25NL. A solver really struggles with the concept of True EV. True EV is a human notion. It's ours. We invented it. We understand it. True EV depends on looking at the strategy in front of you, not that strategy over there that you looked at last night. You're not playing against that. I feel like there aren't enough people in the poker world right now driving in this direction, and even if I'm wrong about the fact that a solver wouldn't beat 25NL post-rake, even if a solver would have a pre-rake win rate of 11 or 12 BB per 100, I don't think it would. I still don't believe that we are using solvers in the right way. I think we're overusing them, relying on them, and just kind of floating instead of swimming when it's not that hard actually to learn to swim if you have the right tuition and the right guidance and the right peer group or network. Okay. What's my empirical evidence for this? You may be sitting here like, well, Pete, what are you on about? How can you possibly have tested this? Did you use real-time assistance for hundreds of thousands of hands and track the solver's win rate? No, I wouldn't do that to people. I'm not going to put robots in pools. There are lots of people who do that on sites that will not be mentioned right now. That happens a ton, but I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to sit here and do that. Do some research though. Have a look at poker bots right now. It's actually pretty bad, but most of these are exploitative bots that are changing their systems to try to exploit pool over and over again. It's kind of like an arms race between bots and humans in some dark, dingy, not so moral corners of the poker multiverse. But back to the point today, my empirical evidence that I would like to talk about is twofold. One, GTO Wizard. GTO Wizard is a program that is very user-friendly. It's a browser-based program. It uses loads of pre-archived trees, game solves to generate verdicts. It generates trainer stuff as well, so you can battle the trainer. There's loads of things you can do in it. I'm not actually promoting it today. I don't know why I sound like I am. I'm not even affiliated, but that's the nature of the beast. That's what it does. One of the screens of GTO Wizard, I believe, it's been a while since I looked at it, but it tells you how much EV you lost by taking your line in a spot compared to what the solver would have achieved, which is obviously the best possible result. If, for example, your play was one big blind worse than the solver's play, it will tell you that and it'll flag it up as a meaningful mistake. If it was 6 big blinds worse, it'll flag that up. If it's like a tiny fraction of a big blind worse, it will also flag that up. Now the thing is, one, we don't know if that's actually going to hold true in reality, of course, because EVs are different depending on what your opponent's actual strategy is. But there are people I've taught who don't win at 5NL. I mean this sincerely. I promise you guys, this is 100% the truth. I know people who don't win at 2, 5, 10, and 25NL, but study GTO religiously and try to copy it and compare their EV loss in GTO Wizard. And when they look at that, they see it's very, very low. They're only like a couple of big blinds per 100 worse than the solver. Now, how can that be if they're losing at 5NL and they're only a couple of 100 big blinds worse than the solver according to this output? It's because it doesn't really matter how close you are to GTO. It doesn't actually matter much to your win rate. We've also run an experiment where we looked at 500 zoom regs. We know a couple of 500 zoom regs. We had a look at their win rates and stuff, and we had a look at what was going on in GTO Wizard as well. And what we found is that their EV loss was almost nothing. Like, it was basically nothing. The way they were playing was so accurate that it was very, very close to 0 EV loss, which means that if you were a solver, you could only do microscopically better than those regs. Now, those regs were like break even in the game over these samples and stuff like that, so was the solver. We concluded that the solver wouldn't beat 500 zoom post-rake. Okay, well, this is 25 zoom, so maybe it could beat that because there's more fish just punting off and making blunders to it. Sure, but also the rake is way higher, so that's not so clear anymore. So to finalize here, would a solver beat 25 NL? I would say no. If you put a gun to my head and made me choose, I would say no, and I would say I'm leaning 70-30, no, yes. This is a bit like the Robbie J. Lou, Garrett Adelstein thing where no one really knew and we were all assigning percentages. It's a bit like that, but just over the years, I've also noticed that this is a silly argument and it's ad hominem and it's not one that you should use. But the people I respect the most in poker, like Phil Galfond, a few of my friends I really respect as strong poker players, have this opinion independently to me. And I don't know many people that I truly respect that think that a solver would win, you know, significantly in a game like 25 NL. That's a stupid argument, and I'm sorry if that makes it sound like I think everyone who thinks a solver would win is stupid or something. I don't. It's just that people that I generally really admire and like think they have great poker minds have also sort of gone on this side of the fence so far. That's an awful argument. I'm not saying it's a good one. I'm just giving you guys a bit of factual context about what people in the industry are saying. Be very skeptical if a coach or somebody tries to teach you poker by telling you that if you play GTO, you'll be a big winner. I don't think it's the case. I think true EV is what matters. I'm going 70-30, no yes on this question. Love to hear what you guys think, and don't forget it's carrotcorner.com for all of our stuff. Check it out there, paid content, and do check out this channel for loads of free content too, and our Twitch channel, carrot_corner, as well. Follow along there and catch our live coaching streams and live play streams. I will see you in the next video. Smash the like button, I'll be very grateful. And yeah, can't wait to get involved in the comment section, guys. Let me know what you think. I'll see you there. Bye for now.